For many years, Native Americans have been fighting for rights that were taken from them when European settlers first came to America. Years later, even after movements towards equality took place, Native Americans were still underrepresented. This is how Native Americans started to fight for their equality against their oppressors. A combative Native American group, similar to that of the Black Panther group, gained traction during the 1960s. The American Indian Movement, or AIM, has been around for many years, but it wasn't until the U.S. government called for a termination policy of Native Americans did it become well known. The termination policy wasn't meant to eradicate Native Americans, but take their land and integrate them into American society. The U.S. government wanted natives to follow the same rules everyone else followed. The U.S. wanted to do this because the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the federal bureaucracy was ignoring the poverty of Native Americans. Native Americans were in poverty because Americans forced them out of their land and into our urban culture. The societal pressure strained Native Americans to assimilate into our way of life. They faced difficulties such as being qualified for jobs, being restricted to living in impoverished sections of the city, and being singled out because of their race. The termination policy started in 1953 with the termination of approximately 109 tribes. 2,500,000 acres of land was taken from Native Americans and was no longer protected. This was the turning point for most Native Americans. As the programs continued, the passion that the Native Americans held for their culture only grew stronger, so strong that it led to them claiming Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay as their own. 200 Native Americans seized Alcatraz to protest the harsh and poor living conditions of Native Americans. They decided to live on Alcatraz to symbolize the conditions of reservations that they lived in. They even offered to buy Alcatraz from the federal government for $24 in glass beads and red cloth. The Siege of Wounded Knee began on February 27, 1973, and lasted for 71 days. The Native Americans' perseverance worried Dick Wilson, Sioux Tribal chairman. Wilson and his tribe evacuated to the tribe headquarters in Pine Ridge when he got news of the AIM protest. Instead of creating conflict with the authorities, approximately 200 AIM members occupied the land of Wounded Knee where the massacre took place. Wilson and the government took quick action to capture the Native Americans. Two leaders of AIM, Russell Means and Dennis Banks, criticized Native Americans who tried to stop the siege. They called them Uncle Tomahawks and Apples, meaning they looked Native American on the outside, but they claimed that on the inside they were white. On May 8th, the Native Americans surrendered due to an established agreement. When the trial was held, the Native Americans were found not guilty due to evidence that the FBI manipulated witness testimonies. This would not be the only conflict to happen at Pine Ridge Sioux Indian Reservation. On June 26, 1975, there was another standoff between different Native American tribes at Pine Ridge, which the federal government became involved in after 100 Native Americans were killed. 2 FBI agents were killed in the standoff. In April 18, 1977, Leonard Peltier was convicted of the murder of the FBI agents and sentenced to jail. There were also many acts established that benefited many Native Americans and Native Alaskans. For instance, the Indian Education Act of 1972 was established to meet the needs of Native Americans and Alaskan Native students. This act recognized that Native American cultures and language was different and their education needed to be based on this. This is the only act that deals with Native American education from preschool to high school. Another act that was passed was the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA. It was a federal law that helped seek to keep Native American children with Native American and Alaskan Native families. Congress passed ICWA in 1978 in response to the alarmingly high number of Native American children being removed from their homes by both public and private agencies. The intent of Congress under ICWA was to protect the best interests of Native American children and to promote the stability and security of Indian tribes and families. The discrimination against Native Americans continues even today, as the U.S. government is working hard trying to soil the sacred tribal sites with the possibility of soiling Lake Oahe, the Native Americans' primary water supply.
The Standing Rock have been fighting back against the pipeline that is being proposed in North Dakota. There's been protests in North Dakota, and they have done several things, not just protests, but filed suit. They had lost in an original court filing, but they appealed up to a federal court, and now that sentence just came in a little while ago.
The Dakota Pipeline is seen to be a territory in which past elders, women, and children of Native Americans were shot by U.S. soldiers nearly a century ago. Peaceful protests continue today as the support against the pipeline continues, even though the executive order was passed by President Trump, furthering the demolition of the land. The sacred ground has belonged to the Native Americans for generations and soiling their property with oil, imposing a $4.6 billion burden on current and future generations, will have no benefit for the Native Americans and will cost the government more than it is worth. Celebrities such as Shailene Woodley, Leonardo DiCaprio, and Pharrell Williams are advocates against the demolition of the sacred native land. Shailene Woodley was seen opposing the pipeline as she and many other peaceful protesters were arrested for allegedly trespassing and rioting.
That we can go back to camp peacefully. And they grabbed me by my jacket, and they said that I wasn't allowed to continue, and they have giant guns and batons and zip ties, and they're not letting me go.
We can't talk right here, I guess, if you want, but right now you're going to be placed under arrest for criminal trespass, all right? Okay?
I have one question. I was down there.
I'm not going to answer the questions right now, but right now,
Wait, but
you're placed under arrest for criminal trespass.
okay, great. But why am I being arrested and no one else is who was down there? Is my question.
Because right now I've been told that.
No, you received word that you trespassed on the property, so you're being placed under arrest.
Yeah, but so did hundreds of people. We were all down there. When you asked us to leave, we did.
You're identified.
You're identified.
All right, I'm being arrested.
Due to the fact that the pipeline has no benefit for the U.S. soiling and precious Native American land is not worth it, as it is causing a disruption that can only be seen as selfish and inconsiderate to the people who once lived there. The fight for Native American rights is still continuing today in hope that they one day be treated equally, as it is probable.
It was Pelican Island when the bay was clean. The birds on the flyway used to make the scene, and the rock was green.